So here I'm starting with a piece of African blackwood, approximately 3/4 inches squared by about 6 inches long. And I'm going to begin roughing that down using my spindle roughing gouge and then eventually my 1/2 inch spindle gouge. As I start to get the spindle down to round, I start tapering it so it's a little bit thinner on the end of the tailstock. This makes the shape of the flower turn out a little bit nicer. Now I pull back the tailstock, I put the piece a little bit off center so that what I'm actually cutting now is not going to turn out to be a round shape. I begin cutting a series of coves which will form almost thorns on the stem. There's a lot of stopping and going and a lot of checking to see how it turns out, but in the end it turns out really nicely. Whenever you do off-center turning like this, it's important to have the lathe spinning as fast as safely possible. That way your tool spends more time in contact with the wood and less time floating in the air. Another challenge with off-center turning is that it's really difficult to see what you're cutting sometimes. A lot of the time you're just trying to follow the ghost of the wood as it's spinning. This is why I have to do a lot of stopping and starting to see what my cut actually turns out like. Here, I've moved the piece off-center in the opposite direction. When I cut my coves on this side, I line up the bottom of the cove with the peaks on the opposite side to create the thorny shape. When I'm turning such a thin piece off-center like this, it's important to have a sharp tool and to take really light passes because this piece is really fragile. That sound was a piece of wood chipping off and hitting my face shield. It's easily fixed by taking a few more passes. Earlier I found a small defect in the wood. I simply fill it with fine shavings and CA glue. After cutting it back, it's almost undetectable. Now I've put the piece back on center. I use a caliper and my parting tool to make a 3/8 inch tenon, which will fit into the flower. it's time to sand. I sand up to 400 grit, and then cut the piece free with my razor saw. Now I rough down a piece of maple that is going to be the top of the flower. After getting an approximate shape, I move both ends off center. The goal is to create a twist in the form of the wood. I had originally tried doing it with 3 twists, as I've seen in some YouTube videos, but it was just too much, so I took another try with just 1. Once I'm happy with the shape, I drill a 3/8 inch hole through the center, which allows me to mount it on a jam chuck that I've specially made for making flowers like this. Now that I have the flower mounted on my jam chuck, I have access to the top. I cup it out a little bit and I add a couple of details with a pointed scraper. Now I turn the piece around on my jam chuck, which allows me to round over the bottom a little bit. Here you can see the way that the final shape has turned out. Before I sand the flower, I use a small triangular file to extend those top details down to form a kind of abstract petal shape. After sanding to 320 grit, I did some coloring with alcohol-based inks. After the ink is dry, I sand to 400 grit, which allows me to blend in the color and create some natural-looking highlights and variations in the color. Here's the final piece, after I've glued the stem to the flower. I finished it with tung oil and beeswax polish. If you liked this video and you want to see what else I'm up to, you can follow me on Facebook and Instagram. You can also find my products for sale on Etsy at jwrwoodworks.etsy.com.